Good evening, and welcome to What's Your Story? My guest today is John Ellsworth. There was a time when radio was king of the airwaves. Before television, the world was its audience. Unforgettable moments in history were broadcast live to captivated listeners. President Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats on the radio helped unite us as a nation and led us to victory in World War II. And in 1945, millions of Americans were glued to their radios, tears streaming down their faces when they heard that President Roosevelt had died. Old-time radio shows brought us laughter, sadness, joy, terror, sporting events, Joe Louis versus Max Schmeling, adventure, and music. Radio was used to sell us cars, home appliances, war bonds, clothes, homes, food, and even alcohol and cigarettes. The radios themselves were often works of art. This is the story of how the Vintage Radio and Communication Museum of Connecticut was born. My guest today is the man who started it all, Mr. John Ellsworth. Welcome to the show, John.
Thanks, Jim. Pleasure to be here.
You know, before you got involved with radios, I understand that you taught for 35 years in the Southington school system. Would you please describe for our viewing audience exactly what you did as a teacher and how you got caught up with this stuff?
Well, yeah, I was a technology education teacher at Southington High School for 35 years. And when I came out of college, I pictured myself as a woodshop drafting teacher. And after a few years of teaching at Southington, they needed an electronics teacher. And they asked me to teach it, and I knew nothing about it.
Absolutely nothing?
No. I had taken one course in college and gotten very little out of it. So, so I learned. I said, okay, and I started teaching it, and I was staying a couple pages ahead of the kids. And after a year or two of this, I really started to enjoy it and like the area. And at the same time, my wife and I would go out tag sailing and flea marketing, where we were nuts like that. And one day I just saw this little vacuum tube radio sitting on a table for sale at a tag sale. And I said, I wonder with my newfound knowledge if I could fix that radio. And I bought it. And the next thing I knew, I had about 200 of them around the house, and I was an avid collector. So that's how it got started.
That's how it got started.
Yep.
So you went to a tag sale.
Yep. You
saw this radio there. And that's what started the ball rolling.
That was it.
That's amazing.
Yep.
Do you remember when that was?
It would have been back in probably the mid to early 80s when I started collecting.
You know, you initially began putting radios on display at various sites. Would you please give us more insight as to how that worked?
Well, at the time I started collecting, we lived in a beautiful Victorian home in New Britain. And I put the radios around the house as decor, and every time we had a party or whatever, people would come in and they'd be in awe of the radios, and they want me to tell them all about them and how old they were and where they came from. And so we knew there was a spark of interest there. And so then we started to do a few public displays. Probably one of the best ones was at the New Britain Library. They have a big set of display cabinets going out the hallway to the parking lot. And I put up a display called 5 Decades of Radios, running from the 1920s up through the 1960s. And the librarian people said that one display had the best acclaim of any displays they'd ever had there. So we knew we kind of had something that was sparking people's interests. And
did you anticipate that you were going to get that kind of interest?
No, I thought I was the only one that had any kind of interest in the area at all.
In the whole world, I'm the only one.
Yeah, that was it. And it was interesting back then because in New Britain, there was major garbage pickup every night, and I would go around and I would find beautiful cathedral radios perched on top of garbage cans, not jammed and crushed and smashed and put in, but perched. You could tell the people were hoping someone like me would come along and take it home and fix it. And that's where I found a lot of the early pieces.
Now, when I met and talked with you initially, you said that people left you orphans on your doorstep. What's that all about?
Well, once we started the museum, we opened the museum in New Britain in a little hole-in-the-wall place on corner of Arch and Wallace Street, and there was only 500 square feet of space. But we put advertising out everywhere we could find free advertising in calendar listings and so forth. And as people discovered us and started to come, many of the people, especially right in New Britain, had their grandparents' old radio up in the attic. They had no idea what they could do with it. And as soon as they saw there was a museum, they said, oh, here we go. And so I would come in. At that time, the museum was only open on Saturdays and Sundays, and I was the one that was manning it. And after a week being away, a week from the museum, I'd come in on a Saturday morning, and I could literally not even get into the building because there was so much stuff piled in front of the front door. Radios, parts, manuals, all kinds of things. And people just started basically dumping them on us, but they just didn't have the heart to put it in the garbage, and it had sentimental value, and so they thought giving it to a museum would be the way to go. So the collection grew very, very quickly, almost too fast.
So what's the most astounding thing someone left you? A piece of equipment, a radio or television or telephone? The most astounding thing you found and you went, oh my, look at this.
There have been so many. Just a week ago, we had someone come in with a Radiola 24. For those that don't know what that is, it's one of the first portable radios from probably around 1923, which is extremely early.
There was a portable radio in 1923.
Yes, yeah. It was a portable battery-operated radio, had a big leather handle on top, had a what they call a spiderweb antenna in the cover that you took out and mounted on top of the radio. So there was a big rectangular box with this big rectangular antenna on top of it. This goes back to the one that developed this was Edwin Howard Armstrong. It was an early superheterodyne radio, and it is darn close to the first one that he ever put together. He was basically the first one to create a portable superheterodyne radio, and he did it for his wife so they could take it out on the beach. And this is probably only a year or so later from him doing that.
Well, I don't want to challenge you on your age and put that out to the audience, but are you old enough to remember the old radio shows?
Yes.
Could you tell us, when you walk through the museum and you look at those radios, like I have done, I can hear Jack Benny, I can hear Fibber McGee and Molly, I can hear The Shadow and all of that. When you walk through there, what presently today, how does that move you?
Well, it's interesting. We learned early on in the first year or two of the museum that we had something special because the radios that people grew up with were kind of part of the family. And as people started to come through, even in New Britain, in the small 500 square foot space, I would be giving them a tour, and we'd come around the corner, and quite often it was the woman in the group would all of a sudden her face would light up and she'd point at one of our radios and she'd go, "There's Grandma's radio."
Really?
And what we learned after a short period of time was instead of continuing with the tour, we just would zip our mouths and shut up. And all of a sudden, all this wonderful memory would pour out of this person.
Absolutely.
And they say, "Oh man, I remember going over to Grandma's, and we had to go upstairs first and take our bath and get our pajamas on, and then we could come downstairs and lay on the rug in front of the radio and listen to the Green Hornet." And the people's faces would actually get flushed. They would get red, and they would go home with this, we call it the warm fuzzy glow. We would give them the warm fuzzy glow because it just brought back a memory that had been lost for many, many years, and they just were so happy. And it's still true today.
You know, as I said in the intro, that radio was king at one point, and that was very much true. I mean, everything you got to know came to you through a radio.
Right.
I certainly remember laying on that rug as a kid. My radio, I first learned how to spell because the radio we had was an Admiral. And I remember those letters, repronouncing them until I learned how to spell Admiral. And you'd sit there and they'd turn off the lights and you would just listen to that. It was an amazing time. You know, that's a period in American history that I wish more people knew more about because it's such a fascinating period. I went overseas in the Army. And it wasn't until I got overseas that I realized all the old radio shows that were playing back here because we lived off of the base and we couldn't get the television, so we had radio. So Monday night would be Gunsmoke. Tuesday night would be The Shadow. Wednesday night would be Gangbusters. And it's like you talked about, that warm and fuzzy stuff. After being in the field for 16 days in the Army, you're grimy and everything else. You didn't want to do anything but get home, get in that bathtub or shower, pour yourself your favorite libation, turn on the radio, and relax. Do you recall doing stuff like that?
Oh, yeah. The thing that people don't realize today, I think it's been totally lost, is that the radio was basically the last generation of imagination. Because
nicely put. Last generation of imagination.
As soon as TV came along and all the pictures were presented, you no longer had to make up pictures in your head, and that's what happened with radio. I mean, today the way radio is with talk shows and everything else, people don't even realize that back then in the golden era of radio, the shows were basically TV shows without pictures.
Yes.
And so all the images that people conjured up listening to the shows came from their head. It wasn't presented on a screen like it is in TV. So it was very creative for people because they had to imagine what was there, and it got them much more involved in the program, and it was a cool experience.
Yeah, my wife and I belong to a group of nostalgia radio fans, and they take cruises annually. And people who are into radios from all over the country go on this cruise. And what we learn is the sound effects. Oh, yeah. Because you were talking about that. We learn how to make the sound effects, the horses coming, the creaking door, the brain frying, Donovan's brain. It is such an, you call it imagination. I think that's what I like most about it. Because even to this day, I still listen to those old radio shows. My children didn't grow up with Hansel and Gretel and Goldilocks. They grew up with The Shadow. They grew up with I Love a Mystery. Those kinds of things. What do you think? Do you think radio's going to resurface, or is it making a resurgence? And I asked that question because I was in a record store, and I saw vinyl records being sold again. 33 1/3. And I was told just a few years ago that you're not going to ever see those. Those are gone. So what about radio?
Well, I think radio is still there. Obviously, it's overwhelmed by all the other technology that's out there now, primarily television, but of course, smartphones are doing everything. But I think there's always going to be a niche for radio for the people that want to exercise their imagination and imagine what the show would be looking like instead of having it presented to them. Whether it's going to have a resurgence or not, that's hard to tell because you don't know what's coming down the pike in terms of new technology, the next thing to distract people from whatever they're doing. But I think there's always going to be a core of people out there that will hold on to radio and keep it going, especially the classic form of radio.
John, how many radios do you have at your museum?
We have no clue. We have part of our history. When we left New Britain, we've been through 6 different locations.
Yes.
We got kicked around for the last 27 years.
And you went to those locations because you kept getting bigger.
Partially because we got bigger, and each time it's interesting, until we got to the present place that we're in now, every place we were at, we were only there for about a year and a half and we had to move on.
Yes.
Which made it very difficult because the collection did grow immensely, and some of it was not so much that the collection was growing each time we moved. We looked for a bigger place, but every time we were in any spot, it was as a renter. And quite often we would take the properties and fix them up. They quite often were depressed properties. And we said, we can't have a museum in a rundown building. So we'd fix the building up, which made it very saleable, and the owner would sell it. And so we were out on the street a number of times. But the building we're in now is a 18,000 square foot facility which we were able to purchase and we actually own. And we've been there for going on 11 years now. So we think we finally put down roots and we're not going to get kicked around and moved anymore.
Are you still getting orphans?
Always. Always. We have to gatekeep that process now because we have about 4,000 square feet of our space on display and about another 7,000 square feet of space in storage, and it's stored up to the ceiling. It's packed, and we constantly get things coming in, and we have to screen everything. If it's a run-of-the-mill console and we've got a bunch of them already, we have to sadly turn them down. We cannot preserve everything. Well, up until a point, we were trying to preserve everything that came our way, and we now realize to actually run a museum efficiently, we just can't do that anymore, so we have to pick and choose. And it's kind of sad because, again, it doesn't have to be a special radio. It can be be a plain, simple, run-of-the-mill radio. But the person that's giving us, it was their grandfather's radio or their grandmother's.
It's sentimental value.
There's a huge sentimental value, and we have to be very gentle when we turn these things down and just tell them that we just can't afford the space for every radio that comes our way, or every TV. We do everything now: motion picture equipment, telegraph, teletype, telephone. So we get all kinds of equipment offered to us, and we just have to select. So it's tough.
John, I'm going to throw a word at you here. Okay. Wurlitzer.
Wurlitzer, yes.
What do you have? Something Wurlitzer out
well,
there?
We've had a special project. One of the things that we are now getting to the point with the museum growing and the museum getting notoriety, and I think a lot of it is in the first few years, people didn't believe it was going to survive. And now it's 27 years later, and we've been solving all the way along. So now people have a lot more faith in what we're doing, and we have a beautiful Wurlitzer jukebox that actually belonged to one of our members, and it was not restored. It was rather run down. It did not function. The cabinet was in rough shape, and the member decided that he wanted to sell it. And we hated, he had it on loan in the museum and on display, and we hated to see it disappear. So we got our board of directors together, and we met, we talked about it, and we said, let's see if we can do a fundraiser and purchase this thing and get it restored. So we put notices out to our supporters, people that had come to the museum, people that are members. We have people that support with annual memberships and lifetime memberships. And we raised over almost $3,000 to restore the whole machine, and the cabinet is just about done. We're going to have an unveiling. We're going to have a special party and have an unveiling of it. But the mechanism is the last piece that's going to come together. But when we're done, the whole thing will be totally functional and look like the day it was made. And it's gorgeous. It's not the bubbler type. A lot of people are familiar with the ones that have the bubbles that run up the side. This is the one that preceded that one, okay. And it's from 1940. And it's a gorgeous piece and plays 78 records, plays 24 78 records.
Tell our listening audience, a viewing audience, what a jukebox is.
Well, yeah, that's true. Jukeboxes, yes. What's a jukebox?
What's a jukebox?
Yeah.
That's right.
Yes. Jukeboxes go pretty far back. These were devices that were set up to be in restaurants and bars and so forth to play music, so people could select music. The most recent form of it would be a CD jukebox, where there'd be a whole collection of music in there, and you can push a couple buttons and put a coin in and select the music that you want to listen to while you're at the restaurant or at the bar. But they go all the way back to basically 78 RPM records, which was back into the 30s. And I don't think there were jukeboxes back in the 20s, but I'm not absolutely sure.
There were 78 RPM records in a jukebox?
This one that we have restored has 24 of them stacked up on nickel-plated rings. And the way the mechanism works, you make your selection, and the ring holding the record that you want to listen to swings out from the stack over to the other side of the machine. The turntable, which is underneath, rises up on a piston out of the bottom deck, lifts the record out of the ring, pushes it up against the tone arm, plays the record, drops it back into the ring, and puts it back in the stack again. And it's really cool because there's a big window so you can watch the whole mechanism.
You see the whole process.
Yeah, the early jukeboxes were big on having open windows so you could see the mechanism. And then as jukeboxes got further along into the 80s, they closed all that off so you couldn't see what they do anymore. So we have 3 jukeboxes on display. This earliest one, we have a 1960 Seaberg jukebox, and then we have about a 1980 AMI, and you can see how the whole technology evolved over those decades.
October 30th, 1938, Orson Welles, Mercury Theater. What happened that night?
Well, it's interesting because Orson was going to put on a Halloween spoof, and he didn't tell anybody it was a Halloween spoof. So he set up an invasion of the world by Martians on the radio. And he made it so realistic that anybody that was listening got totally freaked out and thought it was real. It was quite an earth-shaking broadcast that happened. And they had to do a lot of putting out of fires, let's say, as people called in and they made up fictitious towns, but they were like in Pennsylvania, and so people in Pennsylvania were hopping in their cars and trying to drive away and get away, and it was really interesting. But we have the same model microphone that Orson Welles used that night. As a matter of fact, the American Experience people out of Boston actually did a documentary on it for the 50th, 50th anniversary, I believe, of Orson Welles' War of the Worlds, and they came and filmed at the museum and used we have a reproduction radio studio, and they used the studio as the backdrop and a lot of the radios in the production, and it was quite something.
Wow! So people were actually in a panic, running in the streets, thinking that we had been invaded by
really
Mars.
Had been invaded.
It was really that realistic.
It was very realistic.
Wow!
Yeah.
Wow!
Yep. They had a regular radio show going, and they broke into it like it was breaking
they would
news.
cut in with news breaks.
Yeah,
Oh.
And people started to say, "Whoa, this is real," and he really freaked people out.
Yeah, well, I understand that they even had an actor who sounded like President Roosevelt at the time to talk a little bit, and people really got into it. I just can't imagine that. It must have been such a marvelous, marvelous broadcast.
It was.
Boy, I would love to have seen that. And, wow, see the reaction. Now, we've been talking about radios, but you have televisions too, don't you?
We started out as a radio museum, and then as time went on and people discovered the museum, they had other interests related. And we had one fellow out of East Hartford, Russ Baldwin, who had collected all the motion picture equipment that was in all the beautiful theaters before they tore them down here in Connecticut. And he brought his collection to the museum. We put it on display, and he later donated the whole collection to the museum. So we have motion picture. We have television. We have telegraph. We have teletype. We have telephone. Pretty much everything communications, and the way we have it set up, we have a chronology. When you go and you come and visit our display, we take you back to the early late 1800s. We get you before electronics, so you can see how difficult it was to communicate over long distance without electronics. And then as time goes on, we move with a tour. We give everybody a personal tour. You see as each type of technology develops and as electricity is brought into it, the application of the telegraph system, and then telephone and radio and wireless telegraphy actually first, then radio, then television, then the computer. So you see the whole evolution. And the tours, it's amazing. We get people to come in there and they think they're going to spend 20 minutes, and 3 hours later they're still going
walking
strong.
around.
Because we have skilled docents. We've got about 5 or 6 people who are very, very skilled at telling the story.
Sure.
And we generally encourage everybody to take a tour, and they just are amazed at what they get out of it.
Could you quickly tell us about a teletype machine that you have there?
Well, the teletype machine, it was actually featured at Mysteries of the Museum, on the Mysteries of the Museum TV show, because a lot of people, or a myth was developed of the red phone on the president's desk to Moscow.
Yeah, absolutely. The hotline.
The hotline.
Yeah,
well, there never was.
There never was a hotline.
Never was, and they went through debunking that whole thing. They even showed from the Kennedy Library the actual president's desk and how it was set up, and there was no red phone.
Yeah.
But in an adjacent room, there was a teletype system that was connected directly to Moscow. And in fact, Mysteries of the Museum came and featured our teletype machine because they were looking for a working one that they could use in that piece to debunk the whole idea of a red phone. It wasn't a phone, it was a teletype machine.
Tell us the value of the volunteers who help you.
Oh, we would not be here without volunteers. We're very, very proud that everything that is done with that museum is done by volunteers. There's no paid staff, including myself as a director. This is a labor of love for everybody that's there, and it has been on the backs of the volunteers that this museum has flourished and taken off, and we would be nowhere without the people that that help make it happen, and they just keep coming back. But we have so much fun. That's what makes them come back. So.
Now, you got pictures of some great broadcasters out there on the walls too, don't you?
We do. We are the home of the Connecticut Broadcasters Hall of Fame.
Okay.
And starting with the wonderful Bob Steele. In fact, there are more that have been nominated into the Hall of Fame, and we've got to get the CBA to help us get them up and on display. But we are the official site for the CBA Hall of Fame.
So what do you envision for the next 5 years for the radio?
Well, we have a lot of projects in process. We have, in the back already, we have a warehouse of over 100,000 vacuum tubes that we sell and make available to people who are trying to restore radios. One of the things with the museum, we don't have any big revenue stream, and a lot of people don't realize we are not federally funded in any way, shape, or form. It is all privately funded.
Yes.
And we keep this thing going with many different streams of money coming in, that being one of them. These orphans we've been talking about, when they come in and we have too many of them, we have a regular eBay business. And it's the proceeds from eBay which keep the lights on, the heat on, and the mortgage paid.
All right.
But we have a repair facility. We do not do repairs for the public. We actually have a member who is a professional repair person, and he puts on repair classes so people can come in and bring their pet project with them, and he will help them analyze it and repair it.
Right.
It's just all kinds of aspects of the museum that are out there that are growing. So
that's all the time we have for tonight's show. My thanks to my guest, John Ellsworth, for sharing his story. Thank you for tuning in. Our stories are as different as each snowflake and are as beautiful and numerous as the stars. Everybody has a story. What's yours? Until next time, good night.